BBC News at 6 o'clock. This is Diana Speed. Good evening. Boris Johnson is threatening to ditch his own Brexit deal and call for an early election if MPs reject his Brexit timetable tonight. The government has announced a public inquiry into the Manchester arena bombing that killed 22 people in May 2017. A pharmaceutical firm in the US says it may have developed the world's first effective Alzheimer's treatment. Kurdish forces say they've now withdrawn from parts of Syria as demanded by Turkey before a deadline expires this evening. We'll have a special report from near the border. Also tonight, a government U-turn on closing Victorian prisons. Boris Johnson has issued a blunt ultimatum to MPs to back his plan for Brexit, or he'll ditch it and push for a general election. The warning came as the House of Commons embarked on a highly charged debate on the withdrawal bill, which is designed to put the Brexit deal agreed between the Prime Minister and the EU into UK law. Many MPs are angry that they have been given only 3 days to scrutinise such a complex document, a time limit set by the government in order to fulfil its promise of leaving the EU in just 9 days' time. Tonight, Boris Johnson faces 2 crucial votes, which will determine whether he can keep that pledge. Our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, has been watching the debate at Westminster.
Boris Johnson has chosen to dramatically escalate the stakes ahead of tonight's crunch votes by threatening to withdraw his whole Brexit bill should Parliament defy him. In a surprise move, Mr Johnson told MPs he would instead seek to trigger a general election. The move followed mounting concern in government that they were poised to lose this evening's motion, giving MPs just 3 days to scrutinise the legislation, a result that would almost certainly have ended the Prime Minister's hopes of leaving the EU by October the 31st. The threat, designed, it seems, to crank up the pressure on MPs to back his do-or-die deadline, came as Mr Johnson told the Commons more delay was not an option.
If Parliament refuses to allow Brexit to happen and instead gets its way and decides to delay everything until January or possibly longer, in those circumstances can the government continue with this. And with great regret, I must go directly to the point that the honourable gentleman raises. With great regret, I must say that the bill will have to be pulled and we will have to go forward, much as the right honourable gentleman may not like it, we will have to go forward to a general election.
The warning came as Mr Johnson seemed on course to win his first significant Brexit victory in the Commons, with MPs due to back the second reading vote setting out the broad principles behind the deal. This, however, could not disguise the anger among opposition MPs at the lack of time to debate it. The Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn.
So much for Parliament taking back control. Parliament is being treated as an inconvenience that can be bypassed by this government.
And this was the SNP's Westminster leader Ian Blackford.
It is simply an insult to democracy that the government are trying to push this bill through on limited time. And I urge members, I urge even those on the government benches to ask themselves, is this really how they want things to be done?
Mr Johnson also faced ferocious criticism from DUP MPs over a Brexit deal they claim leaves them tied to the EU through a flawed consent mechanism at Stormont. The independent unionist Lady Sylvia Herman.
There is not a single sentence in this bill which explains the new consent process contained in the Prime Minister's Brexit deal. I say very clearly to the Prime Minister, do not take the people of Northern Ireland for fools. We are not fools.
But Mr Corbyn too came under pressure from some of his own MPs in Leave-supporting seats, among them the Labour backbencher Jim Fitzpatrick.
Can I ask him for an assurance that those members on this side of the chamber who exercise their conscience this evening and don't follow the whip will not have that whip removed any more than he had it removed when he exercised his conscience?
Mr Corbyn said he believed in the powers of persuasion, but the support of such Labour MPs could be crucial for Mr Johnson. If, however, the Prime Minister is still defeated, he will hope the EU grants him enough time to hold an election, one which the opposition parties may now find increasingly hard to refuse.
The President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, has said he's begun consulting EU leaders about how to react to the government's formal request for a Brexit extension. He said the outcome would very much depend on what was decided at Westminster, but said the EU would never take a decision that resulted in the UK leaving without a deal. Our Europe correspondent Kevin Connolly reports from Brussels.
Members of the European Parliament and officials at the EU institutions have often been described as following events at Westminster over the last 3 years. Rarely have they studied them as closely as they have today. Donald Tusk made it clear he's already been ringing around the 27-member governments to work out a plan. But he admitted that the EU couldn't decide what to do until it knew what was going to happen at Westminster.
It is obvious that the result of these consultations will very much depend on what the British Parliament decides or doesn't decide. We should be ready for every scenario. But one thing must be clear. As I said to Prime Minister Johnson on Saturday, a no-deal Brexit will never be our decision.
The frustration felt by some member governments at being asked for another extension and a general fatigue with Brexit doesn't mean that such a request would be refused. If Boris Johnson's deal is making its way through Parliament, but looks likely to narrowly miss the October the 31st deadline, then a short technical extension of a few days or weeks could be agreed by EU ambassadors in Brussels. If the legislation fails at Westminster, or if an election is called, then the EU leaders would be required to travel to Brussels for an emergency summit before the end of the month to agree a political extension, perhaps to the end of January or longer. But it's clear that many of them share the view of Jean-Claude Juncker, who says the whole process has been a waste of time and energy.
Boris Johnson said Parliament had been caught in a deadlock of its own making, and he would in no way allow months more of this. But if he fails to win support for his Brexit timetable tonight, it is not yet clear what will happen next and what steps the Prime Minister might take to push for a general election. Our political editor, Laura Koonsberg, has this assessment.
In a short while, a Herculean struggle in Parliament might be well underway. The final clashes in what's already been, frankly, months of angry debate, years of argument, and for the Tory party, years of divide. There is finally a set of laws ready for MPs to pore over that, if passed, would make real our departure from the EU. There is still just a chance, if the votes go the Prime Minister's way,